E.P. Sanders says the Levitical priest had the authority to forgive sins. But the scribes in the scriptures who heard Jesus obviously did not think that the Levitical priesthood could forgive sins. They said only God can forgive sins, and they're 100% right about that. Hey, Dan Arsenal here. Today we're going to do something that's a little different. I'm going to watch another video, a little bit of it at least, and then I'm going to critique it. Two videos in a sense. Here's what we're going to do today. So in Mark chapter 2, there's a wonderful story about Jesus healing a paralytic and forgiving his sins. And then the Pharisees say Jesus is committing blasphemy because only God can forgive sins. Well, I watched a video where Alex O'Connor is interviewing Bart Ehrman. Here we go again with Bart Ehrman. And based on Bart Ehrman's book that I've already critiqued, Jesus, and the book is entitled How Jesus Became God. Of course, Bart Ehrman thinks that Jesus never actually claimed to be God. He never claimed deity himself. That was made up years after his death, according to Bart Ehrman, of course. So I watched that video where Bart Ehrman has a very different explanation for Mark chapter 2. And then a wonderful YouTube channel called Inspiring Philosophy. I highly recommend it. Michael Jones is the driver behind that. And then I watched his critique of Bart Ehrman on Alex O'Connor. So now what I'm doing is adding a little more than 2 cents worth probably, to what Inspiring Philosophy says about Bart Ehrman's idea. And Bart Ehrman gets his idea, by the way, from a guy named E.P. Sanders, who was a so-called Protestant theologian. If you don't believe these things, if you don't believe the Bible, let's say, when you come to this, you approach it from a very different perspective. If you don't believe in miracles, for example, obviously the Bible can't possibly be true, and so you interpret everything differently here. I'm not going to read entirely of Mark chapter 2. I'll read a little of it to get to the cut to the chase here about the blasphemy part, and then you're going to watch a little bit of Bart Ehrman, a little bit of Michael Jones, and then I'm going to bring my 2 cents worth at the end. So here we go. Mark chapter 2, verse 1. I'm just going to skip through here. If you want to read Mark 2, I encourage you to do it. And when he returned to Capernaum after some days, I'm reading from the SV, it was reported that he was at home, and many were gathered together, so that there was no more room, not even at the door. And he was preaching to them, the word to them. And they came, bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 men. And when they could not get near him because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him. And when they had made an opening, they let down the bed on which the paralytic lay. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Well, that's not what he came for, interestingly enough. And then it says in verse 6, now some of the scribes were sitting there questioning in their hearts, "Why does this man speak like that? He is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" If you just read that, it sounds exactly like what it's saying here, that those who were there, the Pharisees, the scribes, the religious leaders, assumed that Jesus was claiming deity because he was forgiving the sins of this paralytic. Now, here's what Bart Ehrman says, and I'll let you watch this, but then I'll come back and kind of summarize it very briefly here.
The great New Testament scholar E.P. Sanders pointed out, in the temple, when Jewish priests would perform a sacrifice, when somebody would bring a lamb or something, there'd be a sacrifice. Once the sacrifice was performed, the priest would pronounce that their sins had been forgiven. They had that authority as priests. What Sanders argued is that what Jesus is claiming is not to be God. He's claiming to have greater authority than the priests. that this is an anti-priestly polemic. It's got nothing to do with Jesus calling himself God. That just as the priest can forgive sins, actually Jesus can.
So, according to Ehrman and Sanders, Jesus isn't claiming to be God by forgiving sins. He is just claiming to have greater authority than the priests. Just as they could pronounce forgiveness for sins, so can Jesus. Does this explanation work? Well, I'm not convinced. For one, the passages that Sanders refers to never say that the priests have authority on earth to forgive sins, like what Jesus says in Mark 2. They just say that the priest shall make atonement for the sinner, and then his sins shall be forgiven. But let's just set that aside for a moment and suggest that maybe the priest would proclaim something similar as to what Jesus said to the paralytic. This actually makes it far more likely that Jesus is claiming to be God.
So what Bart Ehrman says is from E.P. Sanders, he's picking his theologians carefully, that Jesus never claimed to be deity. And so what Jesus is really saying here is that Jesus is only claiming authority above the Levitical priesthood. Who in the world but an unbelieving so-called theological scholar could come up with an idea like that? People have read the scriptures for years and years and years, and even unbelievers knew that Jesus was claiming deity here. One of the criticisms against the Gospel of Mark is that Mark doesn't talk about Jesus being God. Here it shows that that's exactly what he does do. Here's Michael's refutation, which you've already watched. And the refutation is this. Inadvertently, even Bart Ehrman, using E.P. Sanders, is claiming that Jesus did claim to be God. And the reason is, if on their view, E.P. Sanders and Bart Ehrman, on their view, if Jesus says that he has more authority than the Levitical priesthood, the only authority above that to forgive sins would be God. And Michael does a great job with this, by the way. He talks about the Levitical priesthood being God's ordained way to forgive sins in the Old Testament. If you were not part of the Levitical priesthood, make sure you understand this. You have the Levitical priesthood, and then within that Levitical priesthood, you have the Aaronic priesthood. Only the sons, the descendants of Aaron, could be priests, but the rest of the Levites still served in the temple. They were assisting the Aaronic priesthood to do their jobs. And so it was the tribe of Levi. So they call it the Levitical priesthood. But within that, of course, you have Aaron and his descendants being the real priests. The point is here that God so ordained them that anybody who tried to step inside of them or around them was condemned in the Old Testament. You might be killed, you got leprosy, all kind of terrible things happened. If you tried to usurp God's ordained Levitical priesthood as being the ones to administer the sacrifices and assist in the forgiveness of sins. They didn't forgive sins. We'll get to that in a minute. Inadvertently, if they are claiming that Jesus has more authority to forgive sins than the Levitical priesthood, he must be God to do it. Well, I agree with that 100%. Let me add a couple things here that I think are so wonderful. I hope you stick with me on this. My 2 cents worth is this. Number one, it was the Pharisees, the scribes, not the Levitical priesthood, but the leaders of the day were the ones who say Jesus is blaspheming, only God can forgive sins. Now that tells us 2 major things. Number one, it tells us what they thought Jesus was saying. The second thing is they understood what the Levitical priesthood was about. Now think about this. E.P. Sanders says the Levitical priest had the authority to forgive sins. But the scribes in the scriptures who heard Jesus obviously did not think that the Levitical priesthood, Aaron plus, could forgive sins. They said only God can forgive sins, and they're 100% right about that. Who understood this more, the people who were there, the scribes and the Pharisees, or E.P. Sanders and Bart Ehrman, in the 21st century? It just seems obvious here that it's just incredible how much they can misunderstand the whole scenario of this. Nobody thought the priest in the Old Testament could actually forgive sins. No one can forgive sins but God. That's what Jesus would have said. That's what the scribes would have said. That's what the paralytic would have said. That's what everybody in town in Capernaum realized. Only God can forgive sins. Now, let me give you point 2 here, and I love this part here. It took, in the Old Testament way of things, it actually took 4 separate things to forgive sins. And that seems like I'm milking it here. No. This is the point. To forgive sins in Old Testament times, you had to have, number 1, you had to have a sacrifice. People brought their sacrifices and offered them to God, by the way, to get their sins forgiven. The second thing you had to have was the temple. The synagogues were not places of sacrifice. They were places of teaching. Jesus taught in the synagogue in Capernaum, but the temple was in Jerusalem. That's why people prayed towards Jerusalem, because the temple was there. The temple, in their thinking, of course, was the house of God. And Jesus said that too. This is the house of the Lord, house of my Father. And so you have to have a sacrifice. It has to be in the temple. You have to have a priest that administers it. That's the point of the Levitical priesthood, is that they offer the sacrifices to God. They were the ones in charge of providing and offering the sacrifices. They didn't forgive sins. Now watch this. They didn't forgive sins. They pronounced forgiveness on behalf of God. Think about it like this. There are 2 offices here, prophets and priests. The prophet goes to the people on behalf of God and tells the people what God says. The priest goes to God on behalf of the people and offers the sacrifices on behalf of the penitent who comes to get his sins forgiven. But it's obvious, isn't it obvious that God is the one who forgives the sins? The other point is this. The Pharisees were right. Only God can forgive sins. And Jesus seemed to circumvent. That's the whole point. Jesus did not do this in the temple. Jesus did not offer a sacrifice. Jesus was not part of the Levitical priesthood. So he circumvented all those things, the temple, the sacrifice, and the priesthood. Wait a minute. This is the cool part, and this is the grand finale. This is my big 2 cents worth here. According to Hebrews chapter 4, Jesus is the high priest. He's not circumventing the priesthood. He is the high priest in the order of Melchizedek, and that's a whole nother video here. But if you read Ephesians 4, you'll see this, that we don't have a high priest that cannot be touched with the feelings of our weaknesses, but we have Jesus, who has suffered all things in the same way they do. He was tempted in all points just like we are, yet without sin. So he's sympathetic. He's a high priest who is sympathetic. Isn't that amazing that Jesus there is in this scenario here in Mark chapter 2, yes, Jesus is forgiving sins, but he's also the high priest. Well, what about the sacrifice? He's that too. Hebrews chapter 7, he is, as the high priest, he's both the high priest who offers the sacrifice, and he is indeed the sacrifice of himself. He offered himself, and the Bible says once and for all. All the Levitical sacrifices just atone, they covered the sins, but they couldn't pay for sin. They couldn't actually make a person justified. Jesus did. He was the sacrifice on our behalf. So he's the high priest, he's the sacrifice. What about the temple? He's that too. In John chapter 2, he's at the temple and he cleanses the temple, which means he chases away the robbers that were working there. And then he said, destroy, they said, what sign are you giving here? And he said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again. They thought he was talking about the physical temple, the building, but John explains that he was talking about the temple of his body. Wow, Jesus is the priest, he's the sacrifice, he is the temple. It's all in him. By the way, he's the fourth thing. He's also God who forgives sins. And you know what? That's our greatest need. The greatest need of my life is to have forgiveness of sin. Forgiveness of the things that I've been wrong, all the selfish things I've said, thought, done in a lifetime. It's your number one need as well. So I hope you understand this. I hope that you understand the whole point of this Mark chapter 2 scenario is that God does forgive sins. Thanks for watching.